Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 5 Risk Management. By the end of this chapter, we should be able to define risk management, risk identification, risk assessment, and risk control. We should also be able to describe how risk is identified and assessed, assess risk based on probability of occurrence and likelihood as well as expected impact. We should be able to explain the fundamental aspect of documented risk via the process of risk assessment. This include determining the impact of the risk as well as the likelihood of the risk, calculating all of those metrics, and pretty much coming up with a risk assessment approach and risk assessment strategies and documenting everything. We should also be able to describe various options for a risk mitigation strategy including applying risk controls. We should be able to define risk appetite and explain how it relates to residual risk. Lastly, we should also be able to discuss conceptual frameworks for evaluating risk controls and formulate a cost benefit analysis. We'll also look into the current existing frameworks within the US, such as the NIST risk management framework, as well as some of the international frameworks that currently exist, such as COVID and other IT frameworks. Risk management is pretty much the process of identifying risk, assessing its relative magnitude, and taking steps to reduce it to an acceptable level. Now, if you remember from previous lectures and classes, we did mention that risk cannot be eliminated completely. What we can always do, or as well as what organizations can only do, is bring down risk to an acceptable level. An acceptable level meaning a point at which if something were to happen, the organization is comfortable handling that. Organizations must design and create safe environments in which business processes and procedures can function. These pretty much include knowing organizations must know themselves. That is, they should be able to identify, examine, and also understand the information and systems currently within the organizations. The every organizations must know everything about that organization, at least within as for information security professionals, they should know pretty much everything within their job function as well as their organizational boundary. Organizations must also know their enemy. That is, they should be able to identify, examine, and understand the threats facing the organizations. This includes pretty much every organization must be able to understand what really is a threat to the organization. An example of this is someone might say Pepsi is a threat to Coca-Cola, but Pepsi is not necessarily a threat to HP or Apple because there's really nothing that merged the two together. That is from a business viewpoint. Now, when we look into organizations that have a brick and mortar stores, one can say flooding and natural causes can are definitely a threat to their business. When we look into organizations that operate online entirely, then one can say internet access as well as lack of internet connectivity and networks are pretty much threats that the organization faces. And the responsibility of each community of interest within an organization to manage the risks that are encountered. This has to do with the responsibilities of the community interest, including evaluating current and proposed risk controls, determining which control options are more cost effective for the organization, um, including acquiring or installing and updating the needed controls, and ensuring that the controls remain effective, meaning not just install a security or risk control and just forget about it, but the constant need for monitoring to ensure that that control is still serving its purpose. Next, we'll have what we refer to as risk appetite and residual risk. Risk appetite is the quantity and nature of risk that the organizations are willing to accept as they evaluate the trade-offs between perfect security and unlimited accessibility. In a nutshell, this is just talking about what exactly is the organization willing to take, willing to accept. Remember, we keep mentioning that risk can never be eliminated 100%. It can only be reduced down to an acceptable level. Now, determining what that acceptable level is also falls within the risk appetite of the organization. And to give an example, this will be if one has pretty much put in door locks in one's home. If decides not to put any lock, it means that one's risk appetite is really not to put any lock unless regards to security, and that could be driven by the environment in which one lives. Maybe the environment is really safe, so there's really no need for protection against theft because none of that happens. These are all things that factors that usually drive risk appetite for an organization. Now, also, risk appetite can be driven by the organization's capability to deal with the threats it's facing, the threats impact on the organization functions, and other things. Residual risk is pretty much so going back to risk appetite. If an organization has identified that, okay, this is the certain risk that we are willing to accept, but the threat that currently exists is way above the risk, provides risk that is way above what they are willing to accept. It means certain control must be in place to for the organization to pretty much implement and bring it down to a place where they are willing to accept. Now, residual risk is pretty much risk to information asset that remains even after current controls have been applied. So once an organization has applied certain controls and with the controls in place, there are so the control in place has not really covered everything and it hasn't fully brought it down to the organization's acceptable risk or rather or also risk appetite. The gap between the control that has been implemented and the risk appetite is residual risk. Every organization must find a way to deal with its residual risk. Could be by implementing additional controls, could be by transferring that risk to others. An example of transferring risk to others is insurance by insurance actually. Um, think of your home and you're exposed to maybe one lives in a bad neighborhood again and they put all the controls that they can that includes locks that includes um, fences and all kind of theft protection mechanisms but they are still not comfortable that they are fully secured or maybe their properties are fully secured. But however, there's really nothing they can do. No additional controls can be applied in place to take care of it. One thing that can be done is to ensure pretty much get some insurance policy that protects the remaining or covers the remaining risk. At the end, the goal of information security is to bring residual risk in line with risk appetite. Now, some components of risk management includes risk identification, risk assessment, as well as risk control. Risk identification has to do with the ability of an organization, an individual, as well as information security professional to recognize, enumerate, and document risk that applies to the information assets of an organization. There is a process in which risk identification follows to be able, there is a process that every organization as well as professional information security professionals follow in order to achieve and also identify risk. It starts with identifying as well as inventorying and also categorizing assets. Assets are those valuable items of the organization. Then classify, value, and prioritize asset. That is, classify the assets based on different classifications and determine the value of each asset and then prioritize which asset is more important and which one is less important. Identify and prioritize the threats. So the threats to each single asset must be identified as well as prioritized. There is also the risk asset specifying asset vulnerability. So each single asset, one must be able to identify the weakness in that asset and then how the threat can exploit it to be able to pretty much identify the achieve risk identification as it relates to that asset. We also have the risk assessment, which is a determination of the extent to which an organization information asset are exposed to risk. So once we have identified the risk, including the asset as well as the threats, there is a need to pretty much quantify or rather understand how exposed is the asset or the organization. And in order to achieve that, there are certain processes as well in place, which starts with determining loss frequency, that's the likelihood, as well as evaluating the loss magnitude. So if something were to happen, what's the impact? And calculating the risk, assessing risk, as well as assessing risk acceptability. We then have as the final stage, that's the risk control. So after risk has been identified as well as assessed, there is a need to either take an action towards that risk by applying controls or transferring or deterrence or even avoiding the risk completely. And the process we follow to apply controls include selecting control strategies, which we're going to cover, but it pretty much includes how we are handling that risk. Then there is justifying the control. So you don't just protect everything. We protect information assets as well as all assets based on the threats and the likelihood of the likelihood of a threat being happening as well as the impact when an attack happens. So there is a way to there is a need to justify the controls, could be by doing some sort of a cost benefit analysis to understand if even implementing the control justifies that. Because an example would be if one has $100 laptop with no single value, no document inside, nothing really important. So you have $100 laptop and trying to get maybe $400 case to protect a $100 laptop really doesn't make any sense. However, if there is if one has important documents in within the laptop that are considered of high value or even really kind of put a number to it, then it really justifies getting a certain control mechanism in place to really protect that device. Then the last part of the risk control, we are going to look into implementation, monitoring, as well as assessing the controls capabilities if they are functioning as they should. First, we are going to start with risk identification, which includes planning and organizing pretty much a process is going to be the first step. But before we get to that, Entirely risk management requires that information security professionals know how to identify, classify, and prioritize organizations' information assets, and a trust assessment process identifies and evaluate the risk facing each asset. The first step is the planning and organizing the process, which includes risk identification process by following pretty much the project management principle. This includes organizing a team with representation across all affected groups. Every process must be planned out using maybe presentations to management, reviews, periodic deliverables, but everything must be planned out, as well as tasks that are meant to happen must be laid out, assignment be made, timetable discussed, as well as every single individual must know their role and what they need to do. That all falls under planning and organizing the process. The next we need to there is a need to identify as well as inventorying and categorizing our information assets. Usually, this is an iterative process which begins with the identification and inventory of all assets, including all elements of the organization system, such as people, its procedures, the data of the organization's information, software, hardware, networking assets, um, including the people. People are the priority in everything. There is also a need then to, once all the assets have been identified, to then categorize all the assets. That is, categorize the people maybe based on their name, their position, their numbers, their ID, their supervisor, or even their security clearance level, or their special skills, or their job functions. Identify this is IT department, this is the HR department, as well as in terms of the procedures for organizations includes like descriptions and intended purposes of every single asset, and such as a network cable, a laptop, or even a monitor. A monitor is meant to pretty much be that interface where someone sees what's information is being processed. So all those items fall under the IT procedures and assets. And then when you go into HR, could be the vault, the safe, the files, folders, and all of that. That includes employees' records. Then, if we take part of identifying and categorizing data includes classifications of the data, who owns the data, who creates the data, who manages the data, data structure, its size, is the data online, has it been backed up. These are all part of categorizing and inventorying and categorizing assets of the organization. When you look into software, hardware, and network assets, we have to look into the needs of the organizations based on that depends on the hardware, the software, and network assets, as well as we can look into IP addresses, subnets, MAC addresses, type of devices, what function is the certain software or hardware meant to do. These are all part of categorizing assets. Inventory includes pretty much formalizing identification process in some sort of like a form of organizational tool that is just an ability to identify systems elements or organizational assets that make up all its components. Mention categorization, how things can be categorized as well as based on different classification level. The next step involves classifying, valuing, and prioritizing the information assets. So after identifying, inventorying, and categorizing, there is definitely need to classify it. By classify, I don't mean make it secret, but rather to group them into different functions and their different roles, and then add some values to those assets maybe which one is of high value and which one is of less value, and then also prioritizing the assets by either marking it as one of high importance, moderate importance, as well as low importance. And many organizations usually have their actually way of classify data classification schemes. It could be confidential, internal, public, private. The US government have confidential, secret, as well as top secret. The categorization of data must be comprehensive and really exclusive. And it is very crucial to organizations' success to classify every single, or to categorize every single data and also have some sort of evaluation to its asset, which asset is really important. An example could be which one is a generating revenue asset and which one is just a delivery services asset. Within the pretty much government, we do have security clearances that involves how each single data is being classified at a different level. We have the secret, top secret, as well as confidential classifications for data. This is within the U.S. military classification scheme. Next, we have the threat identification and prioritization. That is, after focusing more on the assets, there's also a need to focus on the threat itself. Realistic threats needs investigation. Unimportant threats are usually just set aside. And threat assessment includes which threats presents a danger to assets in a given environment, which threats represent the most danger to information, and also how much will it cost to recover a successful attack if it were to happen based on a certain type of threat, and which threats will actually require greatest expenditure to prevent. So that is which threat is actually really more expensive to, put some protection against. Each of each of the threat that has been identified should have some sort of each threat that has been identified should actually have a potential to attack any of the assets that needs protection. And last, we have the asset vulnerability identification. That is the specific avenues that a threat agent can exploit pretty much to attack an information asset are referred to as vulnerabilities. And there is a need to examine how each threat could be perpetrated and list organizations' assets and vulnerabilities. Oftentimes, process really work best when people with diverse background within organization work iteratively in a series of brainstorming sessions, that is bringing people of different backgrounds to pretty much come up with a strategy on how to approach things, as well as how to approach threats, protection, risk controls, and all of that. So these are the five major these are the five steps each organization as well as information security professionals should at least follow at a minimum to identify risk. Of course, there are a lot of organizations that exist that pretty much have their own different steps and approach to identify risk. An example is the US government used NIST risk management framework to pretty much the risk management framework process to identify risk, which we are going to touch a little bit as well. These are some pretty much a hypothetical example of vulnerability assessment that is on a DMZ router. When you look at the threat, maybe a compromised intellectual property and possible vulnerability that could happen is copyright works developed in-house and stored on intranet service can be copied without permission unless the router is configured to limit access from outsiders. So yeah, if the boundary or gateway router is not really configured to block access, intruders intruders might be able to compromise intellectual property or even steal. We have an example of threats as it relates to espionage and or trespassing, as well as everything, including forces of nature, human error. If you want, you can pause this page and go through all the different threats and the possible vulnerabilities these threats might have on a DMZ router. Next, we have the risk assessment, which evaluates the relative risk for each vulnerability. And it also has the planning and organizing risk assessment process step that is the first step of risk assessment. And the goal at this point should be to create a method for evaluating the relative risk of each of the listed vulnerabilities that have been identified. Second, we have determining the loss frequency, which is pretty much the likelihood. And to describe pretty much this just should describe assessment of likelihood of attack combined with expected probability of success. That is, what are the chances of losses happening if a threat happens, or what are the chances of a threat happening, or what are the chances of us being attacked? That all falls under the determining the loss frequency. Also includes the use of external references for values that have been reviewed as well as adjusted for each circumstance. That is looking into other places that faces a similar kind of threat to see how things have been addressed. And it could be a sign and likelihood should have some sort of a way to be determined either by assigning a numerical value or some sort of a qualitative or quantitative approach, either in numeric or a categorization way, could be high, medium, low likelihood and chances. And then the third part, we have the impact, that is evaluating the magnitude of loss. So when something were to happen, if an attack were to happen, there is a need to determine what is the impact. How much did we lose as a result of this attack? These are all things that need to be known. An example will be if an organization has a if an organization again with like Coca-Cola, if Coca-Cola were to lose its recipe, what is the impact on Coca-Cola? Basically, the impact means they can no longer produce or they will have a huge competition from outside world. Competitors might be able to produce an exact similar drink as Coca-Cola and call it with a different brand, all because Coca-Cola lost its recipe. So that is the impact on Coca-Cola as the company when their recipe were to be accessed by others. This is pretty much involves determining how much of an information asset could be lost in the event of a successful attack. And it usually combines value of information asset with percentage of asset lost in event of successful attack. There are certain difficulties involved with this. That is, one, you need to know the value of an asset to be able to understand the loss of the loss magnitude. Because if you don't know the value and importance of an asset, how would you be able to determine what the loss impact is? And the next step involves calculating the risk. So once a security professional knows the impact as well as the likelihood of an attack as well as the impact on an organization, then that is being used to calculate the risk. The risk is the likelihood multiplied by the impact. That's it, pretty much. Once you know the likelihood and you know the impact, you combine the two and you determine the risk. Next, we have the assess risk acceptability. Now, once you identify everything, you understand the risk that happens and everything, and you also look into, okay, this risk, would we be able to control it? Based on the impact, should we accept this risk? Should we ignore this risk? Should we pretty much mitigate this risk, or should we actually avoid this risk? That all falls under the risk control that we are going to look into. But the acceptability for each single threat and associated vulnerability that have a residual risk, there is a need to create a ranking of relative risk levels. Residual risk is the leftover risk, as we mentioned earlier. And if risk appetite is less than residual risk, then it must look for additional strategies to further reduce the risk. That is, every security professional must definitely look, or organization must look into strategies to further reduce the residual risk to um, an acceptable level. However, if the risk appetite, that is the acceptable risk, is greater than the residual risk, then every organization must pretty much proceed to the latter stage of risk control. Next, these are pretty much an example of a ranked vulnerability risk worksheet. As you can see, we have the different types of assets, that is customer service request via email, and then what's the relative value of that risk, and then an email, a vulnerability that might happen to that, and what is the loss frequency as well as loss magnitude. This is just an example for you to play around with. Next, we have the risk control, which involves selection of control strategies. That is, either we defend, transfer, mitigate, accept, or terminate the risk. And it involves pretty much justification of strategies to upper management and implementation, monitoring, and ongoing assessment of adopted controls. The three stages, or pretty much the three steps for risk control, involves with the first one being selecting control strategies. That is, once you have finished identifying your risk and assessing the risk, now you need to decide what you're going to do with this risk. Do you defend it? Do you transfer the risk? Or do you mitigate it as well as accept or terminate? And that can only be done once risk has been pretty much ranked, kind of the rank vulnerability risk worksheet is complete. One has pretty much finished understanding the likelihood and impact and calculating the risk, and also understanding how it impacts the organization and what is the best course of approach. Now that also includes the level of threat and value of asset, which definitely plays a major role in selecting the strategy. Couple of things that really usually drives strategy selections include a vulnerability must exist, and a vulnerability can must be able to be exploited, and it's a another one has to do with like when the attacker's cost, that is when someone who's trying to attack you, um the cost of loss, how much you're going to lose, is pretty much more than what the control is. Because if the control is more than the value of the asset, then it really doesn't make any sense to put control there. and also when a potential loss is substantial. And for defense, it includes attempts to prevent exploitation of the vulnerability, including the threat, and it's usually the preferred approach to pretty much just block any risk that is of high value and significance to an organization. The three common methods of risk avoidance, as we mentioned earlier, includes application of policy, education, and training, as well as pretty much applying technical controls. Next, we have the transference. This strategy attempts to pretty much shift risk to other assets, processes, or individuals or organizations. That is how we gave an example with insurance. If one cannot really handle the risk, then they should transfer it where another organization will take the hit if something were to happen. Just the same way we pretty much put car insurance, the way we put car insurance policy on our vehicles. As a rule of thumb, if organization is lacking the resources, then the organization should definitely hire individuals or firms that provide security management and pretty much risk expertise to be able to help them understand which strategy to take. We also have mitigation, which involves attempting to reduce the impact or rather um, to reduce the success of the attack that might happen. This approach usually includes incident response. So when something happen, an incident happen, there should be an incident response plan that defines the actions to be taken when the incident is in progress. Disaster recovery, that is pretty much a reactive measure where if something has happened, then it's the common mitigation procedure and preparations for recovery. And then the business continuity plan, there should be a plan in place that will help the business move forward, and it usually encompasses continuation of the business itself after an attack or either a catastrophic event or anything that is detrimental to the organization happens. The fourth one is the risk acceptance, which involves doing nothing to protect the vulnerability and accepting the outcome of pretty much its exploitation. This happens when really the threat is of no significant value to the asset, or the asset is, I mean, you just don't really care about the asset, or is of low value, or the cost of pretty much mitigating the risk is higher than the value of the asset. Then we have termination as the last one, which involves the organization or the individuals just avoiding completely to do business or allow themselves be exposed to that risk. They might just seek an alternative when the risk is just unbearable and they just don't want to deal with it. Now, for every control, there will be a need to pretty much justify the control strategy, which is before you implement a control for a certain threat or vulnerability, then the organization must pretty much explore all consequences of vulnerability to information systems as well as to all other business functions to understand if that control makes sense. And usually this includes items that affect cost of controls or safeguard and maybe the cost of development or acquisition of the control, the training fees, implementation costs, service costs, maintenance costs, ongoing, because these are all part of controls overhead that over time will cost the business. So there is a need to understand if having all those things in place justifies putting the control. And One of the ways to actually two ways to do that. I'm going to put a note on Canvas that pretty much give a detailed outline of everything I'm talking about right now for your for your reference, including how to calculate and justify control strategies by calculating the cost benefit analysis as well as the process results. Definitely look on Canvas. I will put something like that and also refer to the text for an in-depth explanation of the process result. But the process result of how to justify control strategies. But also, the process result is pretty much an estimate of a potential loss per risk, and it is usually calculated using by understanding the asset value, exposure factor, single loss expectancy. That is when something happens, what is the single loss expectancy? And the single loss expectancy is also determined usually by multiplying the asset value and exposure factor. And also understanding the annualized rate of occurrence, that is in a year, how many times is this going to happen? And by knowing that, you calculate the annualized loss of expectancy, loss expectancy by multiplying the single loss expectancy by the annual rate of occurrence. I will definitely put some notes on this for you to be able to follow as well as just play a little bit with the calculation and the formulas. Then we have the cost benefit analysis as another way to justify control strategies. It is usually it usually determines if an alternative being evaluated is worth doing, as well as if the cost is worth it, and if based on assessments and everything, the implementation is justified for that same control. It usually involves understanding the annual loss expectancy that happened and then the annual loss expectancy that might happen and then subtracting one out of the other to get the annualized cost of the safeguard, that is annualized cost of the control. And that is basically the cost benefit analysis. Please refer to the textbook as well as my notes, or just shoot me an email or text me if you need in-depth cost benefit analysis and the process results determination to justify control strategies. Next, we have actually for the control, we also have two ways to calculate risk. One is the qualitative, which includes the non-numerical approach, and then we have the quantitative, which includes the numerical approach. We also have we also have the last part, which is implement, monitor, and assess controls. Now, once a control strategy has been selected and justified, then there is a need to implement the control, which could be a technical or whatsoever, but basically it's just the implementation of the safeguard. And then there is a need to continuously monitor and assess the control to ensure that it is working as it is meant to be. Pretty much everything I kind of covered regarding the selecting of risk control strategy is shown here. And as a rule of thumb on strategy selection, rule of thumb on selection can be applied when a vulnerability exists, when a vulnerability can be exploited, when attacker's cost is less than the potential gain, and when potential loss is substantial. In addition, this is pretty much the process results and cost benefit analysis and the two ways to calculate the risk. You can pause this page and copy the formulas and understand the process results calculation and cost benefit calculation. But these are what I just covered earlier, the details how pretty much to justify risk control strategies. Then the last part, which is the implementation, monitoring, and assessment of risk, involves understanding how to implement it, the control itself, and then monitoring and assessing the control to make sure that it is working as it's meant to be and it still serves the purpose it is meant to serve, and the organization continues to benefit from it. This is the risk management framework, which provides a process that integrates security and risk management activities into the U.S. federal system development lifecycle. We covered SDLC as part of Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. If you need a refresher on SDLC, definitely refer back there. But this is how the U.S. government approach risk management for all federal system, federal organizations, and um, pretty much government functions. There used to be 6 steps, but beginning December 2019, there will be another step called prepare. It's actually already in place. It's just the practice will become official in the next 6 months. That's by December. But the prepare stage involves pretty much carrying out essential activities at the organizations, that is, at the US federal government organizations, as well as their mission and business processes. And it includes pretty much helping the enterprise or the organizations prepare everything needed to manage its security and privacy risk using the risk management framework. These are reference documents, like the outer layer you're seeing in green that says SP 818 or SP 830. These are reference documents that you can definitely pull out of the NIST website that will guide you on how to pretty much understand the risk management framework. And as we go a bit inside for the categorized system, you see there's FIPS 199, 800-60, and CUI registry. These documents will give you a guide on how to categorize a system, select the control, implement, and all of that. The next step is categorize as computer, categorize. And categorize involves categorizing the system and the information processed, which is information processed, stored, transmitted by the system based on an impact analysis. So basically, everything that the computer does or the system does as it relates to its information needs to be categorized, and the system will be categorized based on that information. Then there is the next step, which is select, and it is usually an initial set of baseline security controls that is provided as part of the NIST 800-53. It's it really breaks down the controls at the high, moderate, low, and different control families such as the AC, IA, SP, and all those different families. And selecting the controls is usually based on the security categorization. So if you categorize the system um, as maybe high, then you select all the high controls. If you categorize the system as moderate, then all the moderate controls will be selected. And then if the categorization is low, all the low controls will be selected. Next, we have the implement. So once all the security controls have been selected, then there is a need to implement the controls. And there are a lot of documentations out there that guide you how to implement security controls on federal systems, but the official one from NIST includes SP 800-34 as well as -61 and -128. Really guides you step by step on how to implement the security controls. But because every single, be it system software, is different, the documents only provide a high-level guide of what needs to be achieved to ensure that control is being implemented, rather than a step-by-step procedure or guide of click here, do this on every single system to implement the control. Next, we have the assess. That is, after all the security controls have been implemented, there will be a need to assess those controls and see if they are really implemented and they are functioning as they are meant to be, and every single loophole or gap has been really covered, or an acceptance of risk is in place to ensure that control is going to function as it should be. And that assessment is usually carried by the SCAs, that's the security control assessors. And they once they are done with the assessment, they will provide what is referred to as SAR, that's the SAR, a system, no, a security assessment report. Based on the security assessment report, there is the next step, which is the authorize. The authorize is authorization of the entire system based on the security controls that have been implemented and based on the categorization of the system. It's usually done by the authorizing official. This is a high level person within the organization. It could be the CIO, the CTO, if you or even the CISO or any high level executive within the organizations are usually the authorizing officials, and they usually just sign the document that authorizes the system and say that usually says the system has been authorized to function at this level and all of that. And after that, it means the system can now go into production and the development is over and everything, and now the system can function as part of a US federal system. And then the next step, which is usually an ongoing step, is the monitoring step. And that involves constantly assessing the implemented security controls in the system, basically in an ongoing basis to ensure the security control effectiveness, and always documenting any change or upgrade, and just pretty much ensuring that there are enough security controls required and all the security controls are updated to ensure a good security posture of that specific system. There are a lot of automated tools that helps with monitoring, and at different stage there are tools that usually helps with um, like implementation. There are a lot of scripts out there that will help when it comes to like implementing security controls on Windows systems. Assessments, there are just guides, and also a lot of tools out there that can that can conduct vulnerability assessments and find loopholes. But next, we have the benchmarking, baselining, and best practices within organizations. Best benchmarking, it basically involves the process of seeking out and studying practices in other organizations that are pretty much one owns, or rather pretty much are organizations that desires to duplicate or help in terms of uh, providing guidance on how things should be. There are usually metric-based measures that are, and these are measures that are based on numerical standards. They are usually um, more towards numerical standards and provide guidance, provide benchmarking processes. And they usually say, all right, this system is at this level based on these numerical standards. And then we have the process uh, based measures, which are more strategic and less focused on numbers. Due diligence, we mentioned that it is knowing what is right, and due care is knowing what is doing what is right. Next, we have the baselining. The baselining involves pretty much a comparison of past security activities and events against an organization's future performance. And the performance value or metric used to compare changes in pretty much the threats or objects being measured are useful during baselining, and they usually have some sort of a guide to the overall process in terms of how the baselining should happen. And it's basically the minimum security requirements or the minimum security implementations for an organization. So An example would be part of a baseline of an organization. The minimum password requirement should it's usually 12 characters. Now that is the baseline for that organization, which means every system must have at least 12 characters as the minimum requirement for that organization. Best practices are just efforts that provide a superior level of information protection that includes when organizations consider best practices for adoptions and uh, they should always consider things like, does the organization resemble the identified target organization with best practices? So this kind of means, okay, if an organization is copying a certain best practice with it from another organization, the if organization A is copying from organization B certain best practices, then organization A must make sure that it identifies the same type of targets as well as the same type of threats with the other organizations, with organization B. Also, organization A should ensure that their resources are similar with organization B for the best practices to be pretty much aligned. And also, organization A should look into if they have similar threats with pretty much organization B. That will make it a bit easier in terms of inheriting best business practices. And to finalize that, best business practices just means looking into the type of business. If you are in the manufacturing industry, then looking into what are the best practices within the manufacturing industry. But always making sure that your processes aligns with the general manufacturing industry processes. There there are certain problems sometimes with benchmarking and also adaptation of best practices, and the biggest one is that organizations do not talk to each other. So their processes might differ, but nobody knows. So organization A might find itself copying just the general best practices of different of the industry's service line without really knowing that things have changed for different organizations. And because the organizations do not talk with each other, it impacts their own processes and practices. Also, no two organizations are identical, and best practices are always a moving target. It is pretty much part of our security professional due diligence to definitely know what are the best practices within their industry and also aligning their goals with the best practices or making sure that the best practices fit their organizational needs. Some recommended risk control practices to pretty much convince budget authorities that includes like the board of directors to spend up to a value of asset to protect from identified threat. So if a certain threat is identified to have an impact on a certain type of asset, on at least there should be some sort of a budget or some sort of a protection up to the value of that asset in order for it to be effective. Then choosing controls should always be some sort of a balanced mixture that provides the greatest value to as many asset threat pairs as possible. That is, rather than just implementing control that protect one asset, if there is a way to get a control that protect multiple assets and also it's effective, then that is also always the recommended approach because it minimizes cost as well as it ensures could be layered security or maybe even defense in depth. Another thing is organizations should always try to make things simple. really, without going too complex, because complexity is really not a preferred way in terms of um, security processes. The simpler and easier to understand, the better. That doesn't translate to ineffective control, it just translates to ease of management. Because if a control is too strict and complex, you'll find it that a lot of people, even internally, will try to circumvent those controls and just find a way easier for them. Always, even as a security professional, one should focus more on cost as well as make decisions based on risk. And a lot of the times, money drives the risk. So when making decisions, do not make decisions on, oh, this control is the best, but rather this control is what will be more effective towards this type of risk, as well as this is what will save more money. It is always important to document every single step, as well as every single processes and every single control, every single decision that a security professional or an organization makes should be documented to ensure continuity of business processes. And this brings us to the end of chapter 5. And in this chapter, we were able to cover risk management. We covered what residual risk is. We also identified the components of risk management, including risk identification, risk assessment, and risk control. We also looked into the strategies for risk controls and risk approach, including defend, transference, mitigate, acceptance, and also to terminations. We looked into cost benefit analysis, benchmarking, baselining, and best practices. Thank you. And this brings us to the end of chapter 5.